You can start.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending today's webinar, Resilient Energy Efficient Communities in the Real World. We will discuss technologies and programs that support community energy efficiency and resilient infrastructure. My name is Heather Buckberry, and I will serve as your moderator today. My panel co-leader, Madeline Saltzman, will lead the Q&A session at the conclusion of the presentations. And Lynn Pyle with ACEEE will be our producer for this panel session. Before we begin the presentations, there are just a few housekeeping announcements to address. You may customize your screen. You can rearrange windows, resize them, minimize them to drop down to the menu at the bottom of your screen. You can click through the widgets at the bottom of the screen to see the available options. Presentations can be downloaded as PDFs from the presentation list in the menu. All of the attendees are in listen-only mode, but can submit questions at any time using the Q&A box available in the menu bar at the bottom of your screen. The presenters can respond to questions throughout the session and at the end of the presentations during our Q&A session. All the presentations will be available for on-demand viewing on the Engagement Hub immediately after this session. Later today, there will be informal sessions and social times that will be offered. You can find Zoom links to those in the session icons in your menu bar. ACEEE would like to acknowledge and thank sponsors for this event. Our gold sponsors are E for the Future, Energize Connecticut, Eversource, National Grid, Sacramento Municipal Utility District, Southern California Gas, and UI. Our silver sponsors are ComEd, the Energy Coalition, Energy Trust of Oregon, Johnson Controls, Northeast Energy Efficiency Alliance, On Semiconductor, Samsung, and TRC. And bronze sponsors are Guidehouse, NYSERDA, Opinion Dynamics, and Vermont Energy Investment Corporation. Now I'd like to introduce our speakers. They are Ariel Drehobel, Matt Lockwood, and William Marin. We'll start first with our speaker, Ariel Drehobel. Ariel is a Senior Research Associate for Local Policy with ACEEE. She conducts research and analysis and provides direct policy assistance on local level energy efficiency and energy affordability policies and initiatives. Ariel will discuss energy efficiency policy opportunities for low-income communities. Ariel.
Great, thank you for that introduction. So I want to start today by saying it's great to be kicking off this panel for the Resilient Communities track at the summer study, where all of the papers are focused on how we can better achieve resiliency within communities. So for this presentation, I'm going to be discussing research in how energy efficiency investments can be directed towards low-income communities by looking beyond just residential programs at how these investments can be made within community-serving institutions and nonprofits and other organizations within local communities. And I believe that these types of programs can help move us towards building more resilient and equitable communities overall. All right, so I think most of you have probably heard a lot about ACEEE already, and I just had a short introduction. I'll just flag that, again, I work on the local policy team at ACEEE, and a lot of the work that I do focuses on low-income energy efficiency programs and energy equity broadly. All right, so the premise of the research that I did for my summer study paper is that we should be investing more resources in low-income communities. So I thought I'd start off this presentation with some thoughts on why we need these targeted investments. Low-income communities have been shaped by histories of underinvestment of resources due to a number of federal, state, and local policies that have led to outcomes such as racial segregation, high poverty rates, poor housing conditions, and lower educational opportunity, to name a few, as well as barriers to financing and many others. And examples of policies that have led to these outcomes include broad policies such as neighborhood segregation and redlining, mass incarceration, employment discrimination, discrimination in access to mortgages and other loans, and a legacy of segregated and underfunded schools. So I want to flag that due to these policies, low-income communities also tend to live in older, less efficient buildings with older appliances and HVAC systems. And this means that by making low-income homes more efficient, this can greatly reduce the burden that energy bills place on these households and address a lot of these other systemic issues. And it's important to note that low-income households tend to face many barriers to participating in energy efficiency programs, such as financial and time barriers and others related to the policies that I mentioned previously. And I think it's also important to note that currently utilities do not distribute proportional resources to low-income communities. So the two charts that are on this page, they might be kind of small. I think you can make it a little bigger. The two charts are showing from the CE 2018 annual industry report that 5% of electric ratepayer spending and 22% of natural gas ratepayer spending on efficiency investments went towards low-income communities, most of which are residential. And overall, about 30% of the total population in the US qualifies as low income, meaning that these resources are not proportionately serving the sector. We also see that most commercial and industrial programs do not have low-income specific requirements or seek to distribute resources equitably within the low-income sector. So by directing more funds towards low-income communities more broadly outside of residential, energy efficiency programs can help address some of these impacts caused by past policies. All right. And I'll just pause for a second to check with the moderators. Are my slides advancing? I see a little message that maybe they are not. Does it look like everything is good? Okay.
Yes.
Oh, perfect. Okay. All right. So continuing forward. So this slide has an overview of how the local policy team at ACEEE currently thinks about equity in the energy efficiency sector. Right now, we tend to focus on these 5 areas here that are listed on the slide, which include addressing high energy burdens of residents, accounting for low-income considerations when designing programs, creating targeted programs, inclusivity in utility and local planning processes, and inclusive workforce opportunities. As I mentioned, we realized that much of the focus on programs reaching low-income communities that we had seen tended to be focused on residential households, with not a lot of research or work looking at how programs are reaching non-residential buildings within low-income communities. So we found that we had this research question of how energy efficiency programs are reaching non-residential customers, and this question fit into these 2 equity consideration categories here that are highlighted. And so we then set out to conduct some research to see how implementers are currently serving the sector and how they can better serve the sector. So the rest of the presentation, I'm going to focus on the findings from my summer study paper and a larger research project that I completed last year. So this research explored how utilities, federal, state, and local governments, nonprofits, and other energy efficiency program implementers design and implement programs to serve low-income communities outside of residential programs. And if you want to learn more about this research, you can read the summer study paper in the proceedings, which highlights a few case study examples in detail, or check out the whole report, which is linked here, which includes all of the data that we collected for this project. So the main framing that we used for this research focused on programs that reach community-serving institutions in low-income communities with energy efficiency investments. So we define these organizations as those that serve community needs and may include many of those that are listed here on this slide, such as nonprofits, shelters, community centers, and small businesses. Communities consist of both residential and non-residential buildings and residents, and creating programs that only reach the residential sector in under-resourced communities leaves a gap in terms of who is able to access the benefits of energy efficiency. So we believe that it's important to reach community-serving institutions in particular with energy efficiency investments, because many of these organizations have experienced a legacy of underfunding and other structural and financial barriers to accessing energy efficiency investments, and that energy efficiency programs can help to address these inequities while also improving energy affordability and community resiliency. So this slide has a list of some of the barriers that community serving institutions face when trying to address or when trying to access energy efficiency investments and improvements, and also lists many of the benefits that they can gain from doing so. I'm not going to go into each of these right now, but if you're interested in learning more about these, you can check out the report or summer study paper for more information. So for this study, we conducted an online survey to collect information about programs that specifically target low-income communities with non-residential programs. And most commonly, we found that these programs were in utility commercial portfolios, though many were also offered by non-utility implementers as well. So we aimed to collect a variety of examples to get a sense of what these programs look like across different implementers nationally. We sent out an email to our listservs and contacts with the survey in April of 2019, and we collected responses through May of last year. And from this survey, we collected data on 39 programs that specifically aim to reach non-residential and community serving institutions within low-income communities. So this slide has some high-level trends that we found amongst programs from the survey. To start, we found that eligibility requirements and targeting varied greatly across programs. Only 6 of the programs that we found exclusively targeted low-income communities, while the rest used additional incentives or had some additional targeting efforts to reach these communities as part of a wider program offering. Program implementers used diverse definitions of low-income communities with specific indicators to identify communities to target beyond just looking at income as an indicator. We also found that 11 of the programs used building size or energy use, high energy use, as indicators of organizations or buildings to include within their program targeting. For measures, we found that lighting and HVAC improvements were most common, and we also found that some programs included water measures and many offered, or just a few actually offered solar investments. Unlike most residential programs that target low-income communities, most of these programs did not cover the full cost of the program measures and instead required participants to pay some of the costs themselves, though about a third of programs did offer to cover the full cost. 4 programs included workforce goals in their program design, such as ensuring that they used diverse vendors or they created local jobs. In addition, while many state public utility commissions have exemptions or separate cost-effectiveness rules for low-income residential programs, we found that very few of these non-residential programs that are reaching low-income communities had different rules for cost-effectiveness to account for some of the benefits or barriers that may be experienced trying to reach this community. And finally, less than half of the programs were able to provide us with evaluation data, all of which that we collected or is included in the report. And we show the average kilowatt hour saved per building or therm saved per building. But because this data was sparse, we weren't able to really determine the most effective kinds of programs in terms of energy savings alone. Through our literature review and interviews with program implementers, we also identified leading strategies to better reach community serving institutions with energy efficiency programs. At a high level, these include conducting deep and meaningful stakeholder engagement practices, where implementers start early and engage often, developing partnerships with community serving institutions on program outreach and design, targeting specific types of organizations, such as nonprofits or shelters, and creating marketing campaigns and outreach strategies to meet the needs of these particular sectors. And finally, we found that some program implementers also use community-focused qualifications to identify communities and participants. And this can include additional dimensions of equity by considering more than just income when identifying target program recipients. Some of the qualification criteria we saw included looking at, beyond income, included things like graduation rates, housing vacancy, unemployment rates, and other factors. So often, the programs would use a variety of factors to identify communities to target with these programs. Now I have a few program examples that I want to highlight. So the first is Energy Outreach Colorado's nonprofit energy efficiency program, which is also known as their NEEP program. Energy Outreach Colorado is the statewide implementer for Colorado's low-income energy efficiency programs. In 2007, Energy Outreach Colorado created the NEAP program through a stakeholder engagement process to determine the best model to support nonprofit organizations. They saw that many nonprofits were in need of energy efficiency investments and were unable to access them in other ways. So they set out to create a program that could meet their needs. Their program provides energy efficiency upgrades just to nonprofits who meet the criteria of doing work that supports the low-income community or supports specific low-income communities, that they pay their utility bills directly, and the organization will remain in their building for at least 3 years so that they're able to experience the benefits, the energy saving and other benefits from the investments. The program provides guidance from the beginning of the process through the end inspection, as well as free project management and continued support for nonprofits that participate. And Energy Outreach Colorado also leverages funds from a variety of sources, including the local utilities, local governments, and are also able to leverage additional funds that EOC raises through fundraising. And they're able to use these funds to cover health and safety measures and other barriers that may prevent the organizations from participating. The NEAP program serves 40 to 65 nonprofits per year and reduces customer bills by an average of 15%. The bill savings then are able to help the nonprofits keep more resources in the local communities as they're able to use that money towards their missions. NEAP has also achieved improved equipment reliability and better air quality and comfort in the buildings that they serve. The next program that I want to highlight is the City of Minneapolis's Department of Health's Green Cost Share program. This program launched in 2012 and provides matching funds for energy efficiency, solar, and other pollution reduction projects in commercial, industrial, and multifamily buildings. The program offers 10% higher incentives to organizations that are in the city's green zones, which are 2 areas that the city identified through stakeholder engagement and data analysis, looking at demographic and other factors related to equity, displacement, air quality, and others. The map here indicates where the 2 green zones are in the city. These additional incentives, as well as targeted outreach and intentional relationship building strategies, has helped the city recruit 1/3 of all program participants for the Green Cost Share program from the green zones. And then the last program example I want to share is ComEd's Distressed Communities Outreach Program. The Illinois Future Energy Jobs Act led ComEd to devote additional funds to serving low-income communities within the state. In 2018, ComEd worked with Elevate Energy to launch its Distressed Communities Outreach Program, which as of 2019 had reached 15 municipalities with outreach and energy efficiency program offerings. The program identifies communities based on the Illinois Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunities definition of distressed communities, which means that they look at indicators, the indicators that are listed here on this slide to identify communities to target with financial incentives. So this program has focused on building relationships with the local municipalities and connecting them with, and the community members with energy efficiency programs offered by the utility, such as ones that serve public buildings, provide LED streetlights, as well as upgrades for small businesses and other offerings. For more information on these programs, you can see the summer study paper or the full report. So we also developed some policy considerations for both state and local policymakers and program implementers who want to better reach community serving institutions with energy efficiency programs. These include conducting needs-based assessments to establish a baseline of savings potential from targeting community serving institutions. So first you need to see how much energy you're missing and how much you can save by better reaching the sector. Once these results are analyzed, program implementers can determine if they should change their programs to better reach these organizations. State-level policymakers can also consider setting goals or requirements to help programs be more equitable and accessible. And one way to do this is to think about expanding cost effectiveness criteria for these programs. I've seen this done for a few programs, and this could be, exempting them from cost effectiveness requirements or having alternative rules for these programs. State and local governments can also work to allow for robust financing mechanisms and incentives to be offered for community serving institutions, while also addressing things like split incentives and setting diversity targets for building up the local and regional clean energy workforce. So finally, I want to summarize some of the key takeaways that I came away with after conducting this research. We found that program implementers who want to develop programs to serve the needs of community-serving institutions and other non-residential customers in low-income communities must decide if they want to create specific, separate programs to meet these needs, or if they want to add additional incentives or targeting efforts into existing programs to reach this target group. There's pros and cons of both methods. A standalone program could have higher administrative costs, but could also allow for better targeted and more impactful programs. We also found that stakeholder engagement really is key in order to determine what type of program should be offered, whether specifically targeted towards low-income communities or certain types of organizations such as nonprofits, schools, or small businesses. Engaging those who you want to reach in the planning process is key to ensuring that you design a program that will work best for them. We also found that the way that utilities and states identify target communities is really diverse. In the appendix of the full report, we include all of the qualification criteria that we found at the state level, and we found them for 16 different states. And often these distressed communities or areas were defined as, looking at factors such as income, unemployment rates, education, housing vacancy, and others. And these definitions allow for more targeted efforts to reach communities that have been historically overlooked with energy efficiency programs, beyond just looking at the areas with lower than average income. And lastly, I'll just say it's important to note that policymakers and program implementers can really influence the success of these programs. There's a lot of tools that they can take to encourage these programs to happen. And overall, I think there's a great opportunity for energy efficiency program implementers to design programs to reach community-serving institutions within low-income communities. And I think more of these programs can help to make communities more resilient and equitable. And that is it for my presentation. I look forward to answering some of your questions at the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Ariel. I would encourage all of our attendees to go ahead and use the Q&A box to submit your questions for Ariel to answer during presentations and later during our Q&A session. Our next speaker is Matt Lockwood. Matt is a senior engineer with ERS. His work related to combined heat and power systems has included analyzing site power system data, inspection and recommissioning of CHP systems, particularly in New York State. Matt will take a look at CHP system performance during a grid blackout. Matt?
Hey, thank you. And hi, folks. Before I get started, I just want to extend my heartfelt thanks for joining us today. I really wish we could be greeting each other in person, but I am just totally blown away by what ACEEE has been able to put together on such short notice. So my name is Matt Lockwood. I'm a senior engineer at ERS. And for the past 5 years, I've been involved in various education and outreach, technical assistance, and evaluation efforts focused around different DER technologies. So today, I'm going to share some insights from our paper focusing on resilient DER performance during a power outage back in 2019. I want to thank my colleagues within ERS who really contributed a lot to this paper, Praga Mayapin and Jeff Rothstein. I also want to thank the DER team at NYSERDA. This was a really fun and illuminating project, and I'm excited to share what we found with you. So as I mentioned, I've been working on various DER projects within ERS for over 5 years, and many of those were focused on customer education and project development. Now, in that, we educated end users about the value stack offered to customers by DERs. CHP, fuel cells, energy storage paired with solar, they all offer at minimum 3 core values to customers. That's cost savings, reduced carbon emissions, and increased resiliency. Now, resiliency is a term that encompasses a wide variety of different actions and meetings, but in this specific context, I'm talking about energy resilience as a measure of a site's ability to maintain a reliable contingency supply of energy in the event of a power failure. Now, while the economic and efficiency benefits of DERs are already very well understood, their resiliency benefits have been more hypothetical, and especially to the types of facilities who are just now beginning to participate in the DER revolution. Now, this is especially true because the electric grid in the United States is robust, and it provides really few recent significant power outage data points to understand the resiliency performance of DERs in actual emergency grid isolated conditions. Last year, though, we had a rare, relatively benign test case. There was a power outage in a dense urban area that happens to host many DERs. On July 13th of last year, 2019, parts of 6 Con Edison networks in Manhattan lost power for approximately 5 hours, impacting ultimately 72,000 utility customers. Now, this was a relatively small-scale outage, but it did provide an illuminating test case. Now, before we get further into the study, I want to share my key finding, which is really that resiliency is hard, especially in this new era of what I'll call, democratized resiliency. In the next few minutes, I'm going to share a lot of anecdotes about, what worked and, spoiler alert, what didn't work. And necessarily, this summary is focused on New York and on CHP systems, but the pitfalls we uncovered are relevant for really any small DER system installed in any location. The promise of DER service resiliency, really if power independent from the grid, is really real. The technology does work, but the industry as a whole needs to conquer a few remaining hurdles before that will really be realized in practice. I'll finish this presentation with, kind of the 4 key steps that we think will be necessary before we see widespread success. So with that, spiel out of the way, let's get into the study. When the power outage happened, it wasn't really immediately clear to us how far the outage extended. I was not living in New York at the time, I'm upstate, and I became aware of the outage primarily via photos on Twitter and Facebook of the Theater District going dark. So to narrow down the outage area and ultimately identify DER sites that were impacted, I and my team tracked media reports, made phone calls, and ultimately leveraged NYSERDA program data to identify sites with DERs that lost power. We were finally able to establish a blackout boundary and identified 22 CHP systems, 10 energy storage systems, 5 battery, 5 thermal, and 2 fuel cells. So in total, 33 sites with NYSERDA incentivized DERs that lost power during this outage. Now, that last bit, sites that were installed with NYSERDA incentives, why is that actually important? And the reason is, for those of you who might not seen this before, NYSERDA operates an awesome DER performance data portal. It's a fantastic resource for anybody, really system owners all the way through policy analysts who want to understand what happens when the rubber meets the road for DER installations. CHP and fuel cell projects that are installed with NYSERDA assistance are required to submit performance data to NYSERDA for a minimum of 3 years. The battery storage systems in the outage area, unfortunately, we're not reporting data to the site yet, which is really too bad. All 5 of them were configured to offer standby power, and that would provide a really interesting topic for future research. Of the 24 CHP and fuel cell installations in the affected area, we counted 7 of them no longer reported data. That left us with 17 systems that had performance data, all of which were configured to provide standby power and who, again, had performance data. So our next step was to take that data and analyze it to determine whether those CHP systems performed as we expected and as we hoped once the grid went down. So data that is publicly posted to the DER website is all in hourly resolution, and we quickly found that this really wasn't sufficient to draw clear conclusions about how each system operated in response to the power outage. So ERS worked with the data aggregation provider to NYSERDA, Frontier Energy, and we obtained raw performance data for each of those systems. Now, the ultimate resolution varied between 1 minute and 15-minute timestamps, but this was enough for us to draw conclusions. We used 2 of the data channels from that performance analysis, 1 power imported from the utility, and 2 power generated by the CHP system. Now, power imported from the utility provided the individual start and end time of the outage per site. Kind of very simply, any time where the power imported from the utility goes to 0, we could say it was experiencing a grid outage. Now, obviously then, if the CHP system at the building was generating power while we knew the grid was down, we could say that it had successfully transitioned from grid-connected to standalone operation, that they were now generating power independent of the grid and providing resilient power. So what did we find? So this table lays out our findings from the analysis, and unfortunately, these systems as a portfolio did not perform well. Only one of the systems performed as expected, but even that has an asterisk on it. The system was still down for several hours before it was able to restart, whereas we really want to see, a restart within minutes. 2 additional systems, which were co-located at the same multifamily building, were actually able to island and restart, but they quickly shut down. We'll get to the cause later. However, on the plus side, enough power is provided for people in elevators to be able to get out of those. The remaining 10 systems that about which we were able to draw definitive conclusions, we found that they provided no standby power at all during the grid outage. Now, originally, we had anticipated that there'd be some sort of significant performance discrepancy by either system operator or grid interconnection type, in particular between manual transition and automatic transition schemes. However, there were really no clear trends that emerged after analysis of the performance data, which was disappointing. So looking at these results, we were really confused, and we're trying to figure out how do we go from here to uncover more meaningful and illustrative findings. So to move beyond the what happened to the why it happened, the team had to speak directly with CHP system operators to understand the root cause of the failures. So ERS worked with NYSERDA, and together we engaged in collaborative interviews with a small selection of the system operators that were impacted by the outage. Each of these interviews was, between 1 to 2 hours, and we started off by sharing our findings from the analysis phase, comparing that against the vendor's own data, and then narrowing down to really understand the individual stories of the sites. What worked well, what didn't, and ultimately identify the root cause of that system's failure to operate. Now, each individual system had different underlying causes for not performing, but by aggregating those results together, we'd be able to group them together and develop kind of new best practices to get over these issues in future blackouts. So altogether, we interviewed 4 installers and operators out of an initial set of 15, but ultimately that was about 2/3 of the total sites that were impacted. Now, I want to say here again, I'm going to say this a lot, we're focusing very heavily on New York DERs and on CHP systems in particular, because those are the sites for whom we had data in this specific circumstance. Although all of these systems experience major challenges, I would expect to see the exact same results if we happen to be looking at fuel cells or battery energy storage systems as well. These are really a reflection of the challenges of providing energy resiliency at small system sizes, at facility types without a lot of strong institutional technical capability. So our results, this is the interesting part. Our interviews, I think I went too far. There we go. We found that, as expected, each building encountered different, I keep advancing live. Interview findings, hopefully that stays. That doesn't. So I'll just go ahead with my slide content and we'll catch up. We were able to aggregate these unique challenges experienced at each building into kind of 3 key areas. Again, the challenges experienced by each site were really unique, and the vast majority of the sites experienced more than one type of challenge. We grouped these into 3 categories: process issues, which were related to breakdowns in trainings or communication. We'll break this down into interpersonal communication issues and digital communication. That affected about 3/4 of the sites. Equipment issues are where equipment failure prevented the CHP system from either restarting or operating stably. That was about 2/3 of the site. And then finally, a small set of sites, about 1/4, experienced failures that really could only be described as design issues, where some fundamental issue in design or implementation meant that the associated systems were not able to provide meaningful resiliency, even if they had operated. So I'll go into a little more detail in each of these slides, starting with process, finishing with design. And this is going to come across really as a collection of stories rather than a rigorous statistical study. But taken together, I hope that you'll be able to kind of cobble together an image of the various and multifaceted challenges that really stand in the way of realizing the promise of DER service resiliency. So hopefully you guys are on the interpersonal communication slide now. We'll check on that. But starting off, these are the failure points that relied on communication between parties, either at the time of the event or earlier when operators were being trained. Now, in many sites, a relatively small cohort of staff received training on how to isolate and restart CHP systems. And this was especially true of multifamily buildings, where the site's resident managers were usually the sole staff who received the extensive training. Now, unfortunately, the power outage occurred on a beautiful evening in the middle of a summer weekend, so many of those specially trained staff were not on site. One of the resident managers was off in the Poconos on a vacation. Some people were at home with friends, and as a result, you kind of had the skeleton crew left at the building who weren't able to restart things on their own and didn't know how to restart things on their own. Now, when CHP operators attempted to communicate with people on site, they found it extremely challenging to explain the correct procedures to untrained staff who were not familiar with the equipment. And that's even if they had the ability to contact staff. In multiple cases, operators didn't know who to contact at site, and they couldn't locate key staff members to walk them through on-site issues when an outage occurred. Now, in addition, we kind of heard over and over again from interviewees that training scenarios did not represent the chaos of a real power outage. Anecdotally, one vendor indicated that a site had previously conducted all-hands training sessions with a porter stationed at every single switch, but again, they were operating with a skeleton weekend crew when the power went out, and that didn't work anymore. One vendor even told us that emergencies mean that methodological approaches to go out the window, especially with procedures that are usually well-planned and well-trod. Digital communication issues. We just covered communications and trainings between operators and site staff. Now we'll talk about those digital communication issues. The big things we found here is that not all Black Star performance tests are true simulations of grid outages. Everyone recognizes the value in training and transfers outside of emergencies. And it's actually a required process to receive permission to operate from the local electric utility. However, many sites were really hesitant to fully halt operations and shut down for live fire grid simulations. As a compromise, these sites staged simulated tests to approximate the conditions of a power outage. And those simulated tests did not accurately capture the full extent of potential challenges and the power dynamics that occurred during a power outage. Now, when the power outage occurred, internet service providers for some sites went offline, and the sites were disconnected from the internet. Now, since all aspects of the intended communications chain were not online, remote CHP operators were severely limited in their ability to remotely operate these systems, which really highlights the fact that any piece of the system of the kind of communications chain to operate these systems and get them to relaunch is vulnerable in the event of a power outage. So now we've gone through the challenges centered around communications, and we're going to speak very briefly about some equipment issues that a few sites encountered. Again, this was about 2/3 of sites. It's important for me to note up front that, to the best of my knowledge, all of the issues we're going to touch on here pre-existed the outage. They weren't caused by damage from the outage itself. Instead, they were only discovered after the damage occurred. Now, the first is that is some sort of failure in the heat rejection system. This one is more CHP-centric than others we've spoken about. CHP systems are designed to recover heat from the combustion process, and that's an integral part of their design. If heat cannot be transferred from the engine to another medium, it'll continue to build until the engine overheats, and then it's shut down to prevent damage. It appears that in several cases, CHP systems were able to briefly restart, but then had to shut down within minutes owing to heat rejection failures. Now, at least 5 instances that we saw, the pumps that circulate water through the heat rejection systems failed, often due to kind of undiagnosed and unnoticed firmware issues on the VFDs on the motors. The second major failure cluster is surprisingly, but again, caused by issues that weren't caught by simulated power outage tests. Some equipment critical to the operation of the CHP systems were not actually located on standby panels. And in most cases, this was caused by not having critical internet connectivity, which again severely limited communications and remote functionality. However, 2 sites experienced issues with campus-style relay protection systems that weren't correctly configured or installed, which worked fine during a simulated test, but they prevented the system from restarting during an actual outage. Now, finally, this is what I thought was kind of the most interesting one that we encountered in the interview. We arrive at what we call design issues. These are really kind of multifaceted, but if you look at them holistically, they're all caused by one root issue. So think of this more as a conflict with the code. And by that, I mean this code that I have here specifically. This is a snippet of New York City's electrical code, section 2702.1, which governs fuel supply requirements for non-hospital buildings. It states, emergency and standby power systems relying on fuel supply shall have on-premises fuel supply sufficient for not less than 6 hours of full demand operation of the system, with a couple of caveats. Now, this seems pretty innocuous, but it's actually a critical limitation for the ability of DERs to provide meaningful resiliency. Any load in any building outside of smaller, older apartment buildings that has been designated as an emergency load, it must be served by a system fed by on-site fuel, mostly traditional emergency generators. This leaves CHP, fuel cells, and battery energy storage systems out in the cold, and it really causes a cascade of failures in realizing meaningful DER service resiliency. So once again, I think I'm having some issues advancing slides. Hopefully you're looking at a dam breaking. So if you're a facility that wants to use DERs provide resiliency in New York City, first, most emergency or standby applications are going to require that you install a separate parallel generator, usually diesel fuel fired. Two, as a result, most of the critical important loads that you care about are going to be served by emergency generators and not by DERs. Three, in order to save costs, loads on standby load panels are fixed on an individual panel. They can't really be shuffled around to be served by multiple resources. Four, DERs and emergency generators can't run in parallel without expensive modifications to ensure power syncing. As a result of all the situations above, DERs only serve convenience loads and are not offering meaningful resiliency. And that's if you're able to operate at all. Several CHP systems are not adequately loaded above their minimum operating point. We're talking like 3 kW in load and a building that usually runs at a 400 to 500 kW range. Now, the plus side is customers with this failure mode didn't even notice, so they weren't disappointed when their community room lighting wasn't on. But on the other hand, they weren't going to get meaningful resiliency even if their systems had run. So time to wrap up. I'm a little bit over time here. We lay out 4 steps here that are critical in realizing the promise of DER-served resiliency. First, real live blackout power tests are absolutely critical to make sure that every one of the links in the chain is operating correctly when the blackout arrives. One vendor we spoke to implemented monthly live fire tests at all of their sites to combat this issue. Second, resiliency requires clear, redundant lines of communication among all participants to ensure things go well. The first time you're speaking to each other should not be in the middle of an outage. 3, outdated codes may preclude DERs from being able to offer meaningful resiliency, even if every other part of the installation works perfectly. So trade associations should educate and convince code officials that their systems are capable of offering safe, reliable, meaningful resiliency. And finally, last point here, although it may add to individual project costs, if the customer is actually serious about resiliency, then all parties involved in standby power, the customers, DER operators, and emergency generator installers, everybody has to sit down before anything is installed and determine how the system is going to work and ensure that systems are going to be able to operate in parallel and offer meaningful resiliency to that meaningful loads can be served by DERs long term if it is necessary. So that's all for me today. I want to thank you so much for your time and attention. I've really been thrilled to share this information with you and participate in ACEEE's 2020 summer study. Leave my contact information up here. Feel free to ask any questions in the Q&A, or I encourage you to reach out to me directly. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Matt, for that excellent presentation on CHP. Now we're going to hear from our last speaker. That is William Merritt. William is a founding partner at Verdant Associates and specializes in technical and economic analysis of distributed energy resources, including evaluation of DER programs and tariffs. William will explore the energy storage market and cost effectiveness. William?
Hi, yep, thanks. Good afternoon, evening, or morning, everyone, wherever you are. Thanks for taking the time to join us. I'll echo the sentiments expressed by the presenters and the host that came before me. Thank you so much for attending, and thank you to ACEEE for pulling this off. It's really been a fantastic experience working with you all, and I can assure you any kind of technical issues that may arise are entirely on us, the host, the presenters, and not at all on ACEEE, for better or worse. So the title of my presentation is What's in Store for Storage, Understanding Stakeholder Benefits and Accelerating Market Transformation. Per the introduction, my name is William Marin, and I'm with Verdant Associates. You have very likely never heard of Verdant Associates. We were a recently founded company that is a spin-off of what used to be Itron's Consulting and Analysis Group. The group over there focusing on distributed energy resource research and consulting spun off, and now we are Verdant Associates. So I won't spend too much time on that. But what I'm here to talk about is research that we've been doing on California's Self-Generation Incentive Program. California's SGIP, and of course that's my doorbell, apologies, provides incentives for the installation of behind-the-meter distributed energy resources like energy storage. It also provides incentives for combined heat and power, distributed wind, biogas, fuel cells, pressure reduction turbines, etc. But most recently, it has shifted its focus to be primarily a financial incentive mechanism for behind-the-meter battery energy storage. The program has existed since 2001 in various forms. It was originally created in response to the California electricity crisis as a way for customers to reduce peak demand and provide grid benefits. Today, it has additional goals, including greenhouse gas emission reductions, improvements of electric system reliability, and achieving market transformation for distributed energy resources. We have had the privilege of working on this program since 2001, doing a variety of evaluation activities related to impacts, cost effectiveness, and market characterization. We produce an annual energy storage impact evaluation every year, which summarizes, how these battery systems are contributing to CAISO or utility level peak demand, how they're providing bill savings to customers, how they are performing during outages, and specifically our 2019 energy storage impact evaluation will be particularly insightful as it sheds light on how battery storage systems behind the meter performed during some of the California wildfire seasons with PSPS outages. But I'll provide a little bit of background on what the program has done to date in terms of what is put out there in terms of technology. So this is just energy storage systems that have been rebated by the program. And as you can see, as of the end of 2019, the program incentivized almost 9,000 behind-the-meter battery storage systems. Anecdotally, separate research done by our staff suggests that the program is capturing about half of the energy storage interconnections that are going in the state. So really the number of behind-the-meter battery systems that are going in California is probably closer to 15,000 versus the 8,000 that we see here in 2019. These are mostly residential energy storage systems. So think Tesla Powerwall, think Sunrun Brightbox system, which is an LG Chem product. In an interesting contrast to the previous presentation, our experience looking at these technologies suggests that there's actually been a pretty high level of success in terms of the technology's ability to provide backup, particularly in the residential sector. As somebody who's also been looking at CHP for a long time, I would hypothesize that the main difference is that the behind-the-meter battery storage system is designed to simply provide backup immediately. It requires no user intervention. Whereas a CHP system often, requires a facilities manager to intervene in some way. So another cut of this is what increasingly here in California, given the reliability issues related to fires, or even as I sit here today, I'm a PG&E customer. I live in Northern California, and we've been on a flex alert for the past 3 days. I've been trying to pre-cool my home to avoid power outages in the afternoon. So we've seen an increase in the amount of solar systems that get paired with energy storage. And so what this shows is what the industry calls the storage attachment rate. So what percentage of solar systems in the state are being paired with energy storage. And this is a bit of a tangent because this is not SG, Self-Generation Incentive Program application data. This is from a separate analysis that we've done for all net metered customers in the state. And you can see that at the end of 2019, about 6% of solar customers were also installing energy storage, up from less than 1% in 2006. Now, this is also a very high, very localized number. If you live in a area that is subject to public safety power shutoffs, that attachment rate is much higher. So, like I said, we've done considerable amount of impact, cost-effective, and market characterization work on this program. At the end of 2019, we completed a cost-effectiveness and market characterization study of energy storage in California. And so all of what you're going to hear today is based on findings from that study. So while there's plenty to say about impacts, and in fact, we've presented on some of those impacts before at this conference, we wanted to focus on what we're learning in terms of the cost effectiveness of these behind the meter storage system, in terms of market characterization, who is installing them, what are their drivers, what are the barriers, et cetera. So I'll dive in first into the cost effectiveness side. Verdant built a model for evaluating the cost effectiveness of DERs. It considers all sorts of parameters: the customer's rate, the customer's load shape, customer's PV production, price signals, whether they come from retail rates or whether they come from demand response programs, or other types of signals. For example, in the SGIP program, there was a mandate after we found that the operation of energy storage projects actually led to an increase in greenhouse gas emissions. There is now a greenhouse gas signal, which is a day-ahead forecast of what the marginal greenhouse gas emissions will be, and storage systems are now required to co-optimize that greenhouse gas signal along with bill savings, which is the primary optimization mode for behind-the-meter storage, and other things like cost and utility avoided costs, et cetera. Here's a screenshot of the model inputs. I certainly don't expect you to be able to read all that or to, we're not going to spend a considerable amount of time. Probably the most interesting thing about the model is that it does go out 30 years into the future. It allows us to change retail rates over time as California is transitioning to time of use rates. We're able to say that after 4 years, we assume everybody's transitioned to a time of use rate, that sort of thing. Apply retail rate escalations and all sorts of other factors in addition to the typical DER financing, debt equity financing inputs that you might expect to see in a model like this. So I'm going to focus on residential cost effectiveness primarily, since the vast majority of the storage systems that are being deployed in California under this program are, 5 kW, 10 kWh energy storage systems. And what you're looking at here is the participant cost test. These are based on the standard practice manual definitions, and this in particular is a test of the economics of storage from the participant's perspective. So the benefits in this test are primarily the bill savings due to the utilization of the energy storage system, which in California for a residential customer on time of use rates come primarily from performing what's known as time of use arbitrage. So charging the battery during off-peak and discharging the battery during on-peak periods, and just arbitraging that change in energy prices. Other benefits can include the federal investment tax credit and any other tax benefits that the participant receives. And the costs are primarily, of course, the cost of the system and any other costs, acquisition cost, financing costs, et cetera. So we take the ratio of the benefits and the costs, and we get a benefit cost ratio. Cost effectiveness from the participant perspective is defined as a benefit cost ratio that is greater than 1. You'll note from the vertical axis that tops off at 0.9 that across the board, we found that none of these technologies are cost effective from the participant perspective. What does that imply? It implies that over the life of the system, and making certain assumptions about system costs and assumptions about, and by the way, there are far more details in terms of input assumptions and whatnot in the paper, and even more in the 2019 SGIP cost effectiveness report. But what it finds is that the benefits that can result from the utilization of a battery for time of use arbitrage or for bill savings in the residential sector are less than the costs to acquire the system, even accounting for the 30% federal investment tax credit. What this figure also shows is something else that you would expect to see. We've colored this figure based on the type of rate that we assume the customer to be on. And each bar represents a different simulation. In this particular case, we ran 24 residential simulations. And as you can imagine, it's somewhat intuitive that the bill savings potential is a function of the spread and the time of use prices. So the difference between the off-peak price and the on-peak price. And what you find on the right is that the least cost effectiveness case happens to be for a storage system that's installed on PG&E's ETOU-B rate. And the most cost-effective case, which is still not a net positive benefit to the participant, but it gets close to it, is a system on SDG&E's electric vehicle time of use rate, which has some of the widest time of use price differentials in the state. So the main takeaway here was that at current prices, despite the fact that 10 to 15,000 customers have installed energy storage, they're not doing it. Well, the bill savings potential is not really there. What is probably there is an ability to ride through outages, given what's been going on with California, with the fires and whatnot. And so what we looked at was, okay, let's run all these cases, and our model, we were able to simulate power outages, and we were able to assign a monetary value to every kWh of energy that would have been lost. And we said, okay, let's assume that there's a set number of outages, and let's provide a dollar value to all the energy that the energy storage system is delivering during that outage, and let's count that as a benefit to the participants. And then let's sort of flip the model on its head and say, okay, how high does that value need to be in order to break even for participants? And what we found is that when we do that and we run a number of simulations, the break-even value loss load for the residential customers was about $23 per kWh. That's how much value, how much intrinsic value a participant places on being able to ride out an outage. So effectively what we did there is, okay, this thing appears to not be cost effective. You're paying more than the benefits that bill savings are providing to you. So there must be some other inherent value that you're getting on top of that. And so how do we fill that gap? It's with the outage, the ability to ride through outages. And so what that comes out to is a value that is considerably higher than what the national average value is for value of lost load, which is about $1.40 per kWh. So it starts to tell a story about, in California, storage adopters are going to be affluent residential customers who place a high value in the ability to ride through an outage. I'm not going to spend too much time on this figure. There's a lot going on. The main takeaway is that we ran a whole lot of different types of simulations. Some of them with storage co-optimized with a greenhouse gas signal. Some of them with storage also participating in demand response. some of them with storage providing distribution deferral value. And the results are mixed. I think the participant test, as you can imagine, is higher on values where there's electric vehicle rates or demand response. It's another it's another revenue stream for customers. The total resource cost test is highest when the battery system is doing distribution system deferral. And really, it simply points to we still haven't unlocked all these multiple value streams that storage is supposed to be providing, but there is definitely potential there beyond simply riding through outages, which is a very it's not a benefit to all ratepayers. It's a benefit to just the participant. Some touching a little bit on the market characterization as well. We started asking some questions so we could better understand, are there attribution questions here? Are there spillover questions here? 99% of residential energy storage systems are installed with solar PV. That makes a lot of sense financially and from an engineering perspective. You can capture the federal investment tax credit if you pair it with solar, but you cannot for standalone. 50% of residential customers purchase solar and storage at the same time. 44% purchased solar first, then decided to install storage. A very small number of participants purchased storage first, and then they decided they wanted solar. Drivers, as you can imagine, primary driver is backup. 44% of respondents said that their primary driver was backup. 33% said bill savings, and then a few other less relevant parameters like environmental benefits, grid independence, the ability to do time of use arbitrage, and the desire to consume all your solar energy. Whoops, I think I just went 2 slides. We also interviewed non-participants, so we looked at customers that installed solar but decided not to install storage. Primary barriers, as you can imagine, cost is the #1 barrier to increasing adoption of behind-the-meter storage from the participant perspective. Other factors like space, safety concerns, and the look of it were secondary barriers. So I'll wrap it up here. There's a lot of content in the paper and in the report. I just tried to pull out some highlights here. Earliest residential adopters, and we are very much in the early days of this market. They're driven by factors such as desire for backup and grid independence. We find that storage is generally not cost effective to participants, exclusively based on bill savings. Residential users are motivated by highly individualized assessments of the value of storage for backup and have widely varying willingness to pay for it. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you so much for your time. I look forward to reviewing your questions. And with that, I'll hand it back to our moderators to close out our session and manage our Q&A.
Okay, thank you, William, for that very timely presentation on backup power. We are ready to go ahead with our Q&A session that Madeline is going to lead for us. There is still time to submit questions, so please go ahead and use that Q&A box to type in your questions, and we will distribute those to each of the speakers so they can get started. Madeline?
Yes, thank you, Heather, and thank you to all 3 of our lovely presenters for this panel. As you think of questions to submit in, we will address some of the ones that have come in already. And yeah, I'm just excited to, showcase these 3 presentations from the papers that were put together. Of course, please do review the whole panel worth of papers. These represent kind of an array of policy, technology, and real-world analysis issues that represent the diversity of the papers we saw. The first question that will be asked will be to Ariel, and actually came in from a couple people asking about evaluating the cost effectiveness of the programs that you mentioned, and if that's something you could discuss quickly.
Sure. So as part of our survey of programs, we did ask if the program had alternative cost effectiveness rules. We were kind of looking to see if some of the exemptions that we've seen for residential programs are reflected on these non-residential programs. And we found that only 3 of the 39 programs indicated that they had alternative rules, and those included either not having to meet cost effectiveness criteria, but being still evaluated and encouraged to, try to be cost effective. The Energy Outreach Colorado program was a little different. They allowed for the cost effectiveness of the program to be at the portfolio level rather than at the program or measure level, so that some projects could be less cost effective while others were more cost effective. And that is one method that some utilities could use for these programs to make it a bit more equitable, to allow some projects in that maybe on their own wouldn't be cost effective, but combined within all the rest still lead to a cost effective portfolio. One other thing I'll flag just really quickly that I thought was interesting is Hawaii Energy had a program included in the study, and they said that their Energy Advantage program was the least cost effective program in their portfolio, but it was also the most successful program in terms of customer and satisfaction and contractor engagement, as well as like participation and community impact. So I found that really interesting. And it seems like these programs that are serving community needs have a lot of benefits that utilities could consider when they're designing the tests and deciding what they're trying to achieve from them.
Awesome, thank you. And perhaps to kind of continue on the theme of cost effectiveness, Will, some questions came in during your presentation. One about cost effectiveness, were benefits from frequency or voltage stability included in the cost effectiveness model that you guys use? I guess ancillary services in general.
Yeah, so, and I think the question also asked about peak demand charges, so I'll address that separately. So yeah, everything I showed today was for residential customers, but we looked at both residential and non-residential customers in the analysis. And yes, for non-residential customers who have underlying rates with demand charges, we also looked at demand charges as well. And in those cases, the energy storage systems were optimized to minimize non-coincident peak demand. But of course, there you start getting into fuzzy territory, because you can optimally dispatch a storage system to provide demand reduction. But the reality, which we've seen in our impact evaluations, is that you don't always hit that peak demand effectively. So storage systems aren't perfect. But yes, we look at that. In terms of frequency or voltage stability, we do not. Every data point that we have from working closely with project developers and talking to the largest storage manufacturers suggests that behind-the-meter storage systems are not really providing that benefit to the grid. There's certainly a capability there, but we tried to simulate what was actually likely to happen, not what could potentially happen if we could unlock, say, the CAISO markets to every behind-the-meter storage system. So I hope that answers your question.
Great, thank you. And a question specific for Matt. One person asked about the outdated code problem and wants to know how widespread of a problem this is, and are code bodies working on addressing this?
Unfortunately, the answer is I don't know. This research was very kind of New York City specific, and it's the only project opportunity I've had to really kind of dive in into the nitty gritty on CHP served resilience. So I don't have any wider information on that.
Got it. Other questions also came in about applicability outside of New York that maybe would get a similar answer, but people seem interested in how this might fit in the context of California and public safety power shutoffs. I don't know if you have any thoughts there.
It's a great question, and to my knowledge, that was a kind of a new capability that was passed after the devastating wildfire seasons of the past couple of years, and it allows utilities to de-energize and leave communities without power, which of course brings its own risks and hardships, especially for vulnerable communities and individuals. Again, kind of an unsatisfying answer. This specific study really relied on a confluence of positive events, including an outage that was affecting a number of DERs at the same time, and that we happen to have widely available public performance information about those sites in near real time at really high quality resolution. So, with a 1-minute resolution on a number of different CHP systems, you can really kind of understand to the minute what's happening at those facilities. I'm not aware of another resource like that in California, but if it exists, please reach out to me. I'd love to continue working on this.
Great. Going back to Ariel, a few questions came in related to kind of program design. Some questions about successful financing partnerships. There's also some questions about split incentive problems, kind of in an interest of expanding that out. Are there specific program models that you think are really exciting in addressing these issues?
Sure, yeah. Let me think. So based on the programs we saw, in terms of financing, I think we had one program that was funded through a community development financial institution, or CDFI. That was the Pathway Lending Program in Tennessee. And that program, focused on energy efficiency and renewable energy projects and covered the cost for those. And I think they had to reach 60% of the programs had to be from low-income communities. So there are ways that CDFIs and financial institutions can specifically target low-income communities. I think a lot of the other programs were either ratepayer funded, or there were some that were funded through nonprofits or government agencies. But I think in terms of partnerships with banks and lenders and financing agencies, there's a lot of room for growth there in terms of programs that specifically target community serving institutions. And I'd like to see more of those programs being developed. In terms of split incentives, so for those who aren't familiar, split incentives are refer to kind of the relationship between the building owner and the tenant, and how depending on who pays the energy bill, there may be an incentive for the owner to invest or not invest in energy efficiency, or for the tenant to save or not save energy, depending on who's paying that bill. And we did see one policy solution to this. I'm sure there are others also, but one that we highlighted in the report is that states can enable green leasing policies, which are lease agreements that address the split incentive for tenants and those leasing spaces by putting incentives in to save energy, water, or reduce waste in different ways. And I know New York has like a model green lease that commercial buildings can use. So that's so if you're interested in split incentives, you could look into green leasing as a way to address that for non-residential buildings.
Great, thanks, Ariel. Another question for Will. Person was curious about using a national average for the value of lost load, and is there potential for future research where maybe a distribution is used for the value of lost load instead?
Yeah, absolutely. When we looked at that value of lost load, it certainly it seemed inappropriate to assume that's the value that should be assigned to participants in the self-generation incentive program. However, we used it as just a starting point in the analysis. As you can see, we explored different value of lost load values, and we examine how the cost effectiveness changes as you change that value of lost load. So yes, there's certainly room to update those assumptions. Again, we didn't show this, but the demographic research of this program suggests what is likely obvious is that early adopters of energy storage in California are among the more affluent households, so I'm sure they have a much higher value lost load than the national average. It wasn't in the scope of our research to update that, which is usually through survey methods, but there's a lot of room there to make different assumptions or come up with different numbers.
Awesome. Well, I do want to acknowledge that we are at time for our presentation. There are other questions that came in, and we're going to sort those so that the panelists can reply to those even after the presentation. But I hope all the attendees have found it interesting to hear from these speakers, and please feel free to be in touch and review these papers and the rest of the papers of panel 11. Heather, anything to add?
No, I think that covers it. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody.